Check, check, check. 1, 2. Check, 1, 2, 3. Hello, hello. Check, check. This is just a check for the live stream.
Put the PowerPoint on the hard drive,
Okay.
but I'm not sure how on the screen.
Oh, Kathleen will be up in the booth and she will,
She'll do it?
yeah, you have to do it from up there.
Oh,
Switch from the,
so does she need it up there, or does it work?
no, it works from here. She'll
Okay.
just switch. Right now it's feeding our own.
Okay, well, you can just tell
PowerPoint
her
and
it's
then-
right there. It's the only
yeah.
PowerPoint.
If you wanna, if you bring it up on the slideshow. Talk louder. Right. Right. Okay. Oh, can you unmute? Can you unmute the headset mic? I didn't unmute it. Yeah. So once it's
Okay,
up.
so I've done what I need.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Hello, hello. Check, check, check. 1, 2. Check 1, 2, 3. Check, check. We're just checking mics for the live stream. Check, check. Hello. Check, check, check. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2, 3. Check, 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 check. Check, 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 check. Check. It's probably enough. I'll check this one. Check, check. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2, 3. Check, check, check 1, 2, 3.
just to tell you that books are on sale. Ken's most recent book, Toronto Reborn, about which he'll be talking today, is on sale, and he will sign it gladly for you now and at the break. And I believe it's $29. So it's a deal. Right here.
Good morning, everyone. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and learn on this land. Good morning again. I'm Merle McMurray, President of Later Life Learning, and I wish to welcome you all on behalf of our volunteer board, and especially those of you who are attending for the first time. We are very proud of the slate of lectures that we are giving this fall, and we hope you will enjoy the weeks ahead. Later Life Learning has been operating at the University of Toronto for almost 40 years, and is so happy with the partnership we have here at Innis and with Principal Charlie Kyle. I am happy today to introduce Principal Kyle, better known as Charlie, so please join me in welcoming him today.
Hi, everybody. So glad you're back there. Does anyone here know how many times I've been up at this podium at this time? You know which time this is? What the count is? Many, yeah. Obviously, so many you can't keep track. Well, it's.
How many years have you been here?
Well, that would be the same answer, wouldn't it? How many years have I been here? How many years have I been principal? This is my... No. No. Yes, I'm in my 5th year. Time flies. So, as I was riding my bike in today, I thought, well, what am I going to say to them? Because they've heard it all. And I've tried every last charming approach I have in my kit bag. So, really, I'm kind of tapped out. But I've got the best audience. If we could amplify that laughter back to those ranks. Yeah. At any rate, so it's always great to see you back. You've heard that before, but it is great to see you back here. I hope you're happy to be back here. We're constantly working at the college to make it a more hospitable place for you to be. Also, though, of course, our first priority is to make it a great place for our students to be. And so we've got a new group of students that have formed just this past year called the Ambassadors. And they're a group of students who are wanting to kind of take the spirit of Innis forward in whatever ways they can. So I've been talking to them, and I'm going to talk to Merle a bit more to see if there's some ways that we can have some interactions between you as a group and them. So stay tuned for that. And then I want to resurrect this idea of the tours, which had a kind of minimal start last year, but then we ran out of time. So I'll figure that out and then let Merle communicate to you when those might happen, and then I hope there's some take back from you. So that's all I have to say for now. You'll see me again, as you well know. And until then, have a great session here. Have a great year in your lives. And I'll be greeting you again before you know it. Okay, thanks a lot.
I'll try and be brief with announcements so you can listen to the person you came to hear. There are a couple of housekeeping announcements that we need to make. First of all, health and safety announcements. If you have occasion to be near someone who needs assistance because of a health issue, simply find one of the volunteers who's got a necktie on, and they will get that help from the staff of the college. The faculty does have a defibrillator that's available, and there's people trained and know how to use it. Most of you probably have been here before, so you know the location of the washrooms, one near the principal's office, which is accessible, and the other ones downstairs, which are not quite as accessible. There are, both on the table here and outside, blue slips and white slips. The blue slips are for those of you who have concerns about the facility or other things about that you'd like to bring the attention of the board. And the white slips, of course, are for questions that you can fill out during the break and will be answered after the break. I should point out that if you have some concern about the building or the facility in any way, please bring it to one of the volunteers for LLL, and don't take it to the office, and we'll handle it from there. Remind you that food and drink are not acceptable in this room. And then there's one other thing that you may not notice, but we are with cameras recording, or not recording this session, but relaying this session to a room upstairs because we anticipated that for this session we would have overflow, and so we have some people upstairs in the viewing room. The back of some very tall people's heads may get relayed as part of that, but I don't think it will affect your enjoyment at all. Ken Greenberg has been here with us before. He's sort of the planner's planner and the designer's designer, and we're happy to have him back. He has been involved in building this city for many, many years, and it's due to his efforts and those of his colleagues that we have the kind of city we have, and that we will have an even better one in the future. Ken has just published another book. It's entitled, and I have it here somewhere, it's entitled Toronto Reborn, and those books are available to you for sale at the break from the desk here and perhaps outside as well. Ken, we're delighted to have you back, and knowing that these sessions have different presenters each time, we're really happy to have you doing the first session, which will give some context to the whole series. So welcome, and the place is yours.
Excuse me, I forgot to mention that Ken has brought along some of his current book, and they're over here for sale. He'll be glad to sign them, I understand. So they'll be available at the break. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for the very kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to come here. This is a great audience to speak to. Today I want to talk to you about this new book, Toronto Reborn. And I wrote this book because I've been watching some really dramatic changes in our city, as I'm sure you have, and trying to figure out what this all meant, where it is leading us. And in particular, two things that are happening simultaneously. One is an extraordinary amount of growth, and the second is unprecedented diversity. And I came to the conclusion that it's the combination of those two things, and not just the fact of them, but the way in which we're experiencing them, that is making us different from virtually every other city in the world. And I think I say that without fear of contradiction. The difference is lots of cities are becoming more diverse, lots of cities are growing. We're growing faster, and we're becoming more diverse. We now have a city where over 50% of us were born in another country, including myself, and over 50% identify as visible minorities. That makes us the most diverse city on the planet. But the really important thing is that whereas for everybody else, this is seen as a big problem, if you look at what the UK is doing to itself, largely, I think, over the issue of a nationalistic concern about diversity and being part of Europe, you look at what's happening south of the border, you look around the world, and there aren't many places where most people would say that our diversity is something not only are we extremely proud of, we enjoy, and we profit from. It has become the reason, in fact, that people from all over the world are coming here is because we are such a welcoming city. So I was trying to put my mind onto that and talk about how it was happening, how it was changing the city, and how it was changing us. So I'm sure you are all aware of what this looks like. It's quite amazing. We have in our downtown area where very few people lived when I started working with the City of Toronto, recruited by David Crombie decades ago. The population in downtown was very small. There are now over 250,000 people who live in downtown. That will double by 2041. We'll have 500,000 people living in the core, which you see here. So that's to the growth. That we're growing faster than the next three. We have 120 cranes on the sky now. We're growing faster than the next three fastest growing cities in North America. And that includes Mexico City as part of North America. So this is quite an amazing statistic. This speaks to the diversity. I love this image. In the 1930s, the men who worked at the distillery lined themselves up against the wall and took this group photo. They were obviously all male. They were all white. They were probably all Anglo-Saxon in terms of origin, with very few exceptions. So just for fun, the people who work at the distillery now thought they would replicate the photograph. And look at them. I mean, the gender barrier has been completely overcome. But not only that, they are the new face of Toronto. Here's another example. This is when the young subway opened, and people were incredibly excited. The TTC had just built that portion of the subway between 1959 and early 60s. And look at the crowd, and then look at the crowd below. And can we play that little video clip? Is somebody upstairs going to do that? Well, I have to do it? Okay, so this is what I'm working one day a week. I work in Brampton now, and I take the GO train. And when I go to Union Station and I catch the 8:55 to Brampton, this is what I see coming out of the station. This remarkable, I'll just play it one more time. This is, oh, it's not working? Oh, okay, anyway, you can see the still photo. I'm sorry about that. You would have just seen all those people walking, but essentially, that change, which I've witnessed since I've been in Toronto, is nothing short of amazing. And how are we benefiting from that? There was recently probably the biggest tech conference in the world for startups called Collision, which took place at the Convention Center. And the people who put that conference together made a decision to come here and not to Silicon Valley, for the very simple reason, practical reason, that a lot of the people whom they wanted to attend the conference would not be able to enter the United States anymore. They were simply not welcome. And company after company, individuals making life choices are now choosing to come here because of this characteristic of our society. And the reason I have the image below is I would argue that that quality, that gene pool that we are inheriting, is more valuable than everything that is in the ground in Alberta in terms of our future national prosperity. This is what will make Canada successful in the world. It won't be taking stuff out of the ground. It will be the human capital that we have accumulated.
Could you adjust the mic, please?
The lights,
Mic.
the mic, sorry. Is that better? Okay, I'll try and speak closer to the mic. So this didn't happen in an instant. It has been building. And these are two books that I would really recommend that tell this story. The first one, The Making of a Global City, is by somebody called Robert Vipond, who is a professor at this university, I believe. And his kids were going to the Clinton School. Do we have any graduates of the Clinton School here? Okay, this is a school in the west, oh, I got one. In the west end of the city. And he found that they were keeping extraordinarily detailed records of who was attending the school from the 1930s on. And so he went back and looked at those records to look at the changing population. He was very curious about that. And what he discovered is what he identified in this book as 3 waves of immigration and how the school adapted to those waves. So the first wave was in the earliest days that he was tracking, there was a large population of Jewish kids who came to the school. At the time, Leslie Frost, who was the premier of the province, decided that there should be formal Protestant religious teaching in all of the public schools. And so the teachers were obliged to provide that teaching and to keep records about it. And he discovered that in a really interesting act of civil disobedience, the teachers in the school falsified the records and didn't do it out of respect for the kids in the school. That was their, and these teachers, of course, were all white Anglo-Saxon Protestants for the most part. That was a really interesting thing. So that wave was succeeded by another wave, largely Italian and Portuguese kids. But the first accommodation laid the groundwork for the second. And then following that is what he calls global, which is who is at the Clinton School today, which is kids coming from all over the world. But what had happened going back to that period generations ago is the idea of adjusting to difference had already instilled itself. And beyond tolerance, this was really a matter of making people comfortable. The second book is called The Ward. And there are 2 books that were published recently about the Ward. This is the one that I find most interesting, The Ward Uncovered. There's an archaeological dig that took place where the new courthouse is going up right next to City Hall. The Ward was an area that extended from Queen Street up to approximately Gerrard Street, from University over to Yonge. And that was an area where people got off the train when they arrived in Toronto or however they came to Toronto, and there was our version of the Lower East Side in Manhattan. This was the immigrant reception area. And into that area, everybody who was fleeing somewhere else arrived. So it was the Irish fleeing the potato famine. It was former slaves fleeing the US on the Underground Railway. It was the Chinese railway workers. It was Eastern European immigrants, Jewish immigrants, but also other Eastern Europeans. It was Italians from southern Italy. They all ended up being kind of corralled into this ghetto, essentially, in that area. Almost every trace of which has disappeared. Everything was demolished to make way for New City Hall and the public buildings around it. But what was so interesting that happened in that area is because they were all forced to live together in this very tight area, they developed a kind of solidarity in response to the hostile world that was around them, and a kind of fellow feeling developed, which has become very characteristic of Toronto since. It was a kind of a microcosm of what we have become. And then, obviously, with time, they migrated over to Kensington Market, to Little Italy, to Little Portugal, to all of the other areas, Chinatown, where people could settle as they moved out of that area. So this archaeological dig is fascinating because the archaeologists were able to put together a story about who was there based on what came out of that dig. And not surprisingly, almost all the artifacts that they found were in the privies, because that's where people dumped all the stuff that they didn't want. And so they've come up with an incredible collection of artifacts. And if you're at all interested in storytelling and archaeology, I would highly recommend this book. So my argument is that as this mixing, this blending, this overlap of people from everywhere has occurred, and the way it is occurring here, which is very different from the way in which it is occurring in other places, is reshaping the city. And Kensington Market, which is very close to where we are sitting today, is the perfect example where wave after wave has come, and every wave has brought its tastes, its foods, its tradition, its music. The Kensington Jazz Festival, which is going on just this past weekend, has just the perfect example. All of a sudden, we now have all these foods from South and Central America, which is one of the latest waves. But you can literally see there's a kind of food archaeology in Kensington Market where all these traces are still evident. Every group that came through there is still present in some interesting way. And the life on the streets in Kensington is kind of a microcosm of what our city is like. And if you go, this university, and I'm same generation as most of you, we don't look like those early images that I showed you. But as you go down in the generations, you will see the students at this university look completely different from us. And if you go down into the high schools and the elementary schools, even more so. And when I'm in Brampton every week, 70% of the population of Brampton was born in another country. And they come from everywhere. And the extraordinary thing is it works. That is the great gift that we have. So I'm just going to read a poem from you that I discovered when Rick Salutin quoted this in an article in the Star a couple of months ago, and it really struck me. It was written by Robert Frost in 1951, and it's called "America is Hard to See." And this is an excerpt from the poem. "But all he, Columbus, did was spread the room of our enacting out the doom of being in each other's way, and so put off the weary day when we would have to put our mind on how to crowd and still be kind." So what he was talking about, this was an extraordinary thing, 1951. He was talking about the conquering of the frontier in the US and people moving west across the continent and always being able to avoid each other by simply picking up stakes and moving on. This applies to our city now, because we are now at the point where we have to learn, quite literally, how to crowd and still be kind. And that's really the subject of my book. So we, along with that growth, is coming a series of growing pains, many of which are not unique to us. We're having to figure out, for example, how to share rights-of-way, streets, most of which were based on a railway chain 66 feet or 20 meters wide. They're narrow streets compared to other cities. Nobody ever imagined that this city would grow to have the population that it has. It was really laid out as a small provincial city. It wasn't seen as particularly important. And so look at the upper left, what we are experiencing now with cars, obviously, cyclists, pedestrians, transit users, all trying to figure out how to use those narrow rights of way, how to use the streets, how to share them, is a big issue. And you hear the discussion about Vision Zero, about the number of casualties that are occurring. In a funny way, this is replicating, if you went back 100 years, there would have been something similar going on in the streets of Toronto when cars started to arrive. And there were no lanes in the streets, and you had horse-drawn vehicles, you had bicycles, you had pedestrians in large numbers, and these new fangled inventions, the internal combustion engine, running around the streets, and it was complete chaos. And you had a very similar discussion to what we're having now about figuring out how to use the streets. So that's one issue. We have an aging infrastructure that was built in the middle of the 20th century, which was all about moving cars. And so how do we keep it intact? How do we replace it? How do we do different things with that infrastructure? And I'm going to talk about that later. We have climate change, which is absolutely a reality. It's having a dramatic impact on how we design the city, how we live in the city, how we make ourselves safe, but also how we contribute to trying to deal with the phenomenon of global warming. And the city has a huge role to play. Very, very importantly, there's the question of affordability. Who can live in this city? Where can they live? How can they live? And then we have another issue, which much of my book deals with, which is the spaces we share, the common spaces. How do we equip the city for the things that we need to do together and the places we need to be in order to know each other? Not through the windshields of cars, not just online, but actually face to face. So you're probably all aware of the work of Professor David Halchansky from this university, who did groundbreaking studies on the three cities and the fact that we are exporting poverty. We have been exporting poverty since the latter decades of the 20th century out into the first-ring suburbs, where unlike the immigrants who were arriving in downtown Toronto, who had access to transit, who had main streets, who could walk to shop, who had social services present, we're now sending a lot of our latest immigrants out into areas which are car dependent. Many of them don't have cars. Terrible long bus commutes to get to work, especially when they're moving from one side of the post-war suburbs to another. And so this is producing a lot of strains and a lot of difficulties. The issue of affordability, because we are so popular, because we're such a draw, because people want to be here, we're now, and this is not an enviable thing, we're in the top ranks of the most expensive cities for people to live. And this is from a United Way report, this is especially affecting racialized groups in our city disproportionately. So this is really, really important and something we have to pay attention to, because if we don't, we will undermine that precious quality, that gift, I would argue, that we have received. I listen to Metro Morning every morning. I don't know if many of you do. Metro Morning is kind of the soundtrack of this experience. It's the report card on how we're doing. What I love about Metro Morning, what Matt Galloway and his colleagues are doing, is all of the issues that arise around this set of challenges that I've been describing are discussed there. They're discussed really openly. And the very fact that we have that forum and other fora in order to discuss these things is really important. I have to say, when I go to the US and I try to find news on the radio, there isn't anything like CBC or the kind of news that we have access to. Yes, you have NPR, but it has a very different focus and a much smaller audience. But the commercial networks are just not providing that opportunity for that discussion. Congestion. This is something that was put together by the Board of Trade. All the blue on that map represents congestion. They were arguing that even by 2001, the levels of congestion that we were experiencing after decades of failing to invest sufficiently in public transit was a $6 billion drag on the local economy. And then they looked out to 2031 and they said, this is really a crisis. We have to do something about it. And we are trying to catch up. The fact that every government that comes into power tries to change all the transit plans and so on, I don't need to say too much more about that. This is something that Civic Action did. They did a survey and they came up with this word cloud that showed what people felt they were missing as a result of this congestion, the toll it was taking on their lives. And obviously, opportunity to spend time with their families, with their kids, was a hugely important issue. So we have a dramatic need to deal with this effectively. We have to be careful, extremely careful, that we don't become the divided city. And of course, politicians love to find wedges, to find ways of disparaging parts of the population in order to motivate other parts of the population. Name calling, stereotyping, and so a lot of this is so inaccurate, so misleading, but it's very, very tempting for politicians to fall into this trap. And so we have to counter that narrative with the idea of a city that includes all of us. We have to take advantage, in fact, of this incredible thing which is happening to us, which is the arrival of people from everywhere who are sharing space in our city. And just a little anecdote, Errol Nazareth is somebody, again, on CBC whom I really like, who does a great show on music. And all kinds of things are happening in terms of fusion in our city. So yesterday I was listening to Errol and he played something. He said, this is the most amazing thing. This is a piece of music created here in Toronto, and it has two sets of voices, one in Punjabi and one in Bengali. These are from two sides of India. He said, nowhere else would you ever hear these two languages on the same track. And you can group after group. When my son started playing soccer here in Toronto, and I was going to all the games with him, and simple example, the teams which he was playing with all started off as based on certain ethnic communities. And at a certain point in time, when they were recruiting kids to play on their teams, they just went after the most talented kids. So he played on Azzurri, which was an Italian team. He played on Wexford, which has started out as a kind of Scottish, Northern Irish team. And if you looked at all the kids who were playing on the teams, they were just a mix of everything. And so were the parents. So you had parents, when he was playing in the Wexford team, there were Orange Irish and Green Irish parents who were great friends on the same team. We have our little India is actually made up of groups from Pakistan and from India. There are Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims who are killing each other on the Indian subcontinent, who actually make common cause on Gerrard Street in Little India. This is what our city is about. So one of the questions that comes up is, we used to do this in places like Kensington Market. It's now happening in the strip malls, in the inner suburbs of the 416, and in the 905 in places like Brampton, where I'm currently working. This is where that life, that mixing, where coincidentally some of the best food to be had in our city region is available in these little establishments in the strip malls. And again, I keep doing shout outs for CBC. I wasn't planning to, but Suresh Das, who's a great food commentator, spends his life going out to all these interesting places and pointing us to amazing food. How do we make the city capable of accommodating a complete life cycle? All of us, young families with kids, how do we make it comfortable so that it's not just building condominiums for young singles or young couples? We have the full variety of housing. And not only that, as you move from one stage of your life to another, you have the ability to stay in the neighborhood that you care about or nearby. And so we're trying to shift the way we build housing. So with all these questions in mind, when I sat down to write the book, I decided to organize it around a series of stories. You could almost think of them as short stories, taking particular places on the map and taking myself on the ground to those places to describe what it feels like, what it looks like, how it happened, who contributed, and how the change is actually occurring in those places, addressing a lot of these issues. So what I'm going to do now is take you through a series. Imagine that these are a series of trailers, little trailers for extended stories in the book. So I was recruited as a young architect in the late 1970s by David Crombie when the Reform Council had been elected and City Council decided that they wanted to change the nature of the downtown. Believe it or not, as I said, hardly anybody was living there. This is, you'll recognize the back of the Flatiron Building in the top image, and the St. Lawrence Market a little further up in the image, which was slated for demolition because nobody was using it. At that time, when I started, on the chopping block were the St. Lawrence Market, Union Station, and Old City Hall. All were planned for demolition. This area had become a giant parking lot for office workers at King and Bay. That's what was going on there. And the city council had said, they were looking south across the border. They were looking at what had happened in American cities with the hollowing out of the cities, with the building of expressways, with that whole ripping up of streetcars, all of those things that were happening. And basically, Toronto made a decision at that time to be a different kind of city. And so they adopted something called the Central Area Plan, which was about re-inhabiting the heart of the city, of mixing people living and people working. And my first assignment, starting off as with the idea of creating an urban design group in the city, was in what was then called East Downtown. They didn't use the term St. Lawrence at that time. So what has happened since is what you see below. There's not a single surface parking lot to be found. The market is thriving. I worked on parks, from the Sculpture Garden to Birksea Park to St. James Park, all of these wonderful cultural institutions that have come in. And so I tell the story of all of the people who contributed to making that transformation happen, which, when you look at it now and you see the before and after, is pretty remarkable. But what's even more remarkable is how the public sector and the private sector and the nonprofit sector pulled together to make that transition. So this is one of those places. A second is where I'm living now, in King Spadina. And when this story goes way back to an area that was part of the military reserve. It's currently called Wellington Place. You couldn't build anywhere within 500 meters of Fort York because that was the distance you could fire a cannon. And so it wasn't until 1834 that this area was released for development. Wellington Place, that's an image on Wellington Street on the top, was laid out with a very broad and generous right-of-way, about 150 feet, 45 meters, as a greenway between Clarence Square at the lower end of Spadina and Victoria Memorial Square, where I live. And it was modeled on the West End of London, and this was to be laid out with large residential lots. There was a lot for the lieutenant governor's house. This was to be a special area. But shortly thereafter, the railways came in, middle of the 19th century, as they did pretty much everywhere. They took over the area. The residential, by and large, gave way to a whole generation of industrial buildings in the last decades of the 19th century, early 20th century, along King, along Wellington, along all those streets. Highly successful, exported all manner of goods all across Canada via rail, which was right next door. As the 20th century progressed, for reasons that happen everywhere else, the shift from rail to trucking, the moving of the industry out to the suburbs, then globalization, the jobs moving offshore. And so you had this stock of wonderful mercantile warehouse and factory buildings starting to be empty. And what was happening is they were being torn down to make parking lots to reduce taxes and make a profit. And this was happening very dramatically. And when Barbara Hall became mayor in 1994, she convened a small group, including myself, Jane Jacobs, Robert Eisenberg, who was a developer, Gary Stam, who was an economist. And we sat in her office, and Barbara said, okay, I've just won the election. What should I do? And, you know, I'm being a little bit flippant about that, but every new mayor wants to find some legacy project, some really special things that they can contribute. So we were a little think tank to help her work through that. And we came up with an idea, which was taking a page from Jane's wonderful book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, 1961, which was about mixed use. And what that led to is called the King's Initiative, King Parliament and King Spadina, which were 400 acres of these industrial areas on both shoulders of downtown, east and west, said we will eliminate all land use zoning. We will let people live and work and do pretty much anything else they want to do in these buildings, subject to not producing some form of toxicity governed by provincial regulations. And this was a huge departure, because prior to that, the zoning had only allowed industry, not even contemporary office, which is why the buildings were being torn down, because obviously the multi-story factory buildings were not coming back. And so this, over the following 20 years, produced 50,000 new housing units at no public cost. This was just the industry responding. But what was even more astonishing is there are more people working by far in King Spadina and King Parliament than ever did during the height of the industrial era. It's just that they're working in different kinds of jobs. And these two things came about simultaneously. So this is another story I tell in the book. And if you look on Wellington Street in the lower photograph, this place is just brimming with life, with new young families, with all kinds of people doing all manner of things, constantly changing. And Jane used to come to our place. I live right on Victoria Memorial Square in the first new residential building that was built under this regime. And she would stand on our balcony overlooking this, just thrilled by what was happening. And she always liked to say, I just can't wait to see what comes next. So this was truly a tribute to her. A third story is about Regent Park. Regent Park, where I was privileged to work on the master plan, was one of the largest and oldest major public housing projects in Canada, built from about 1949 to 1953. It was on the model of urban renewal, a neighborhood which actually wasn't all that different at the time from what Cabbagetown was identified for urban renewal. It was torn down to make way for Regent Park. The people who created Regent Park had great intentions. They were really trying to provide needed housing. It was seen as in an area of transition. A lot of it was built for returning soldiers after the war. The thought of the people who were building it was people would come, they would be there for a short time, they would find their feet, and they would then move out. It wasn't seen as a permanent community. Well, of course, it turned into something completely different. And there was a phobia about the city, the historic city, about streets and blocks, about the city was identified with all kinds of pathologies. And so this drew on a whole way of thinking about the city that had gestated in the decades before the war, which was about superblocks, about getting rid of city streets, about homogeneous uses. And so Regent Park turned out to be what it was, which on the one hand was completely isolated from the rest of the city. To its detriment, the population was totally different from what its creators had imagined. It was a landing place for new immigrants. That's largely who lived there when I began working there in 2002. They were from all over the world. They were highly ambitious about moving ahead in the society, about education for their kids, but they were poor. And so they were public housing tenants. And we began a process of engaging the community in creating a master plan for the transformation of Regent Park. We had whispering translation in 7 languages. We engaged high school and university students to have kitchen table conversations within the various groups that they represented and bring back findings from people who were a bit shy about speaking up in public meetings. It was one of the most remarkable planning processes I have ever participated in. And I think for those of you who visited Regent Park recently and seen what's happening, it's just astonishing how well that transformation has worked. The same number of rent geared to income units is being produced as existed before, and after work is done, people have the right to return. There is turnover, of course, but people have the right to return to Regent Park. But we've added double the number of market units, so it really is turning out to be a mixed income community. Ironically, it has turned out to be one of the best places in the city to raise children. The Aquatic Center is arguably the best new swimming pool in the city. The Spectrum for the Arts, I don't know if any of you attend events there, is incredible. The sports facilities with the assistance of Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, the hockey, the cricket pitch, new community center, adult university level education courses in which this university participates. Frank Cunningham, who was one of the former principals of Innis College, worked with me to arrange that. So there are free university courses by some of the top professors in the city given in Regent Park. There are healthcare facilities. Everything is there. And it's become a worldwide demonstration of how you transform these previously isolated public housing projects to make them mixed income, mixed use neighborhoods. And so Toronto Community Housing is now doing the same thing in Alexandra Park, just to the south of us, up at Lawrence Heights, and in a number of other places in the city. So that's another story. The Bentway is one of the best things I ever have been involved in. And in many ways, I would say this was the trigger, this was the inspiration for me writing the book. So I wrote a little piece in a journal called The Fife and Drum for the Friends of Fort York in 2011. And because I live not far, and I was watching what was happening, I was seeing City Place, the Fort York neighborhood, Liberty Village, all rising out of the ground with these high-rise neighborhoods. At the time, I counted that there were 77,000 new residents coming. It's now about 125,000 in a really short period of time with very little public space. So in this article, I did a little sketch and I argued that Fort York, the 43 acres of the National Historic Site, and the space under the Gardner, which you see on the upper left, could be a great public space shared by these surrounding neighborhoods, all within immediate walking distance. A few years went by, and in 2015, I had a call from Judy Matthews, who has been very involved with this university. She and her husband Will, for example, made the donation that led to the transformation of St. George Street. They were involved in the music garden, Evergreen Brickworks. They're great philanthropists in the city. And Judy and I had worked together at the City of Toronto. And she said, Will and I are looking for a legacy project, something really special that we would like to do. Do you have any ideas? And I assume she called others at the time too, and I immediately thought of this space under the Gardner. So my wife and I took Will and Judy down to walk into what was then a derelict no man's land under the highway. And they, to their enormous credit, this was a very brave thing to do. They saw what I had seen. And so we were off on a great journey. We met with the councillors, we met with the mayor. A few months after that, I brought in Public Work, a wonderful young firm of landscape architects. To make a long story short, they made a $25 million donation to create the physical space, which we have largely done. We've set up a conservancy. This is going gangbusters. We're doing one amazing thing after another, continuing with the support of the city. John Tory was very instrumental in helping this to happen. We opened with a skating facility in January of 2018. So you can imagine how quickly this occurred, given the timeline I described. And we had 30,000 people come out to try out the skating when it was over 30 below Celsius. And we've just gone on from success to success. Most recently, we had the moon. This past short time, we had Waterlight by Dan Roosgaard from Rotterdam, which with lasers and fog demonstrate what it would be like in the event of a flood with climate change. We had Derive, Noémie Lafrance, who's a choreographer from Montreal, do a dance performance extending over 1.5 kilometers. It's just been one great thing after another, and we're now looking at the entire corridor of the Gardner Lakeshore, all the way from Exhibition Place over to the Don River. So that's another story. This, at the heart of Wellington Place, is a story about public space. This square that you see there, Victoria Memorial Square, starts off life as the burial ground for Fort York, 1793. Simcoe's daughter is buried there, the soldiers from the fort. The War of 1812, the invasion in 1813, those soldiers are buried there. It sits largely unknown, and then in 1834, when the city releases the military reserve for development, that idea of Wellington Place of the Squares comes about. There's a monument done by Allward, who did the great monument in Vimy Ridge, in the middle of the square, to the unknown soldier. It has an extraordinary history. There was a neighborhood of Black Canadians who were railway workers. Lincoln Alexander lived on Draper Street. He was born there, a block away from Victoria Memorial Square. And a Black regiment comes and celebrates every year at this site. So there's just this richly layered history. But prior to the King's initiative, nobody was there. It had been largely abandoned. It was surrounded by parking lots. And now it has become the center of community life for this dramatically changing neighborhood. The neighbors got together. We've erected historic plaques which tell all the stories of all of these layers. We constantly have people from all over the world coming to visit the site. It's part of the National Historic Site with Fort York. So it is a literal physical embodiment of the value of the importance of public space and how that's transformed. Queen's Quay. When I was a student in architecture at the University of Toronto, my first job was in what you see at the back of the top photograph, the terminal warehouse. This was not called Queen's Quay Terminal, it was a terminal warehouse. It was a 1 million square foot warehouse. Trains, freight trains, rolled down the middle of Queen's Quay and right into the building. I worked in a small architectural office in Queens Quay with two of my professors who were here at U of T, who had a little office there. We ate lunch in what was called the Loading Dock Cafe with all of the workers who unloaded the trains. It has gone through a succession of changes. The heavy rail came out, the federal government stepped in and purchased the lands adjoining for Harborfront. What you see in the top image with those trees in the planters, it was something called Harborfront Passage, which I worked on with my professors, which was the first attempt to actually get the public into this industrial area in a safe way and create a barrier from the trucks so that people could walk through the area. Time has gone by. Light rail, streetcars first came. Then in around 2006, there was an international competition led by Waterfront Toronto for the transformation of Queens Quay. I was on the jury for that. We selected a firm called West 8 from Rotterdam, which led to what you see today on the bottom, which is taking out 2 lanes of traffic, creating the separated bike lane, the LRT now in its own right-of-way, replacing the old streetcars, and this great pedestrian way that is so popular. On a good day, it feels like somebody has just tilted the city of Toronto and all the people end up sliding down to the water where they are along this series of parks. Here's another great story not far from here, King Street. As a result of the King's initiative, so many people have come to live from Liberty Village right through King Spadina and that whole area stretching all the way over to Roncesvalles that the King streetcar literally couldn't move. It was just frozen in traffic. And so the city came up with what I've been describing as a made-in-Toronto solution. I've since been corrected. There's something in Seattle similar to this, which happened a few years earlier. But essentially the idea was you could only drive 1 block and you had to turn right. That's it. And by virtue of that, the kind of congestion that people were experiencing has been so diminished that the King streetcar now carries 84,000 people a day. This is more than many subway systems in the world. The cars arrive every couple of minutes or so. And almost coincidentally, it's created a great bike lane, which I use, because there's actually enough space next to the streetcars now with largely very little traffic. And this was done as a pilot. It proved to be immensely successful in terms of increasing the speed with which people could move by transit. Despite some complaints from some of the business owners who thought they would lose clientele because people couldn't park right in front of their stores, businesses have thrived. It's now been approved by the city for permanent installation. So the curb lane will turn into wider sidewalks. I don't know if you've seen all the restaurants and so on that have occupied the cafe spaces on King Street. Pretty amazing. This is a story about nature in the city and in a way about climate change. The Leslie Street Spit. I lived in the beach for 27 years, and with my neighbors, we were watching what was happening in the outer harbor. The city was building what was intended to be a breakwater for a huge harbor that would have served container ships. But what happened is the container ships became so big that they could no longer get through the seaway into Lake Ontario. And so this spit of land extending about 6 kilometers out into the lake had no practical purpose. What happened then was amazing. Nature took over. And with a group that I was part of called Friends of the Spit, we, through, and many other people, and this is a story I tell in the book, got involved and prevented this from being turned into a bunch of large-scale marinas and other commercial enterprises, and kept for nature to produce one of the most extraordinary natural settings in the heart of a big city that you can imagine. If you've been out on the Leslie Street Spit, and it's a great place to bike, to walk, there are also shuttle buses which will take you through, with the most delicate touch, the Conservation Authority and the city are managing this, only intervening in the most subtle ways, and this beautiful landscape is being created basically by itself, where one, starting with poplars and then leading to other tree forms, it's what landscape architects call succession, or ecologists call succession, and now the flora and fauna there is remarkable. And so this really speaks to a whole rediscovery of nature in the heart of the city, and by analogy, the way we think about the Humber Valley, the way we think about the Don Valley and all its tributaries, and an acknowledgement that we live in nature. Which led to another story, which is the Lower Don. In 1912, when the Toronto Harbor Commission was getting set up and they were preparing for industrialization of the city, they identified an area which was the largest, what today we would see as the largest wetlands on the Great Lakes, which they called a swamp. And they drained the swamp, and they created the 800 acres of the Portlands, and they were counting on this becoming a great industrial area. It never fulfilled its promise. It's kind of limping along with marginal uses. And they took the Don River, which flowed into the wetland. It was a kind of headland, and they put it in a channel called the Keating Channel, a right angle bend into this narrow channel, and it eventually was flood prone and a problem. And so there had to be a solution for solving this problem, which affected much of downtown Toronto and the area on the east side of the river as well. An international competition was held. I was on a team with Michael van Valkenburg, great colleague from Boston and New York, wonderful landscape architect, and we won the competition. And this has led to what's happening there today, which is a $1.25 billion project to create a river estuary with 100 acres of parkland surrounding it, which is a more contemporary way of dealing with floodproofing, but also creating recreation, setting up new neighborhoods, doing all manner of things with this land as it now comes into useful purposes. So there's a long dissertation about that in the book. Our public institutions. I ended up working for Sheldon Levy when he was president of Ryerson University with my colleagues at KPMB Architects on a master plan for the university. Sheldon described himself as a city builder, and he was perplexed by the fact that Ryerson University, or disturbed by the fact that Ryerson University was known as the university behind Sam the Record Man. It didn't, even though it was right next to Yonge Street, there was no presence on Yonge Street. And so he was kind of obsessed with the idea of extending a face to the city, of making Ryerson part of the city. That was only one part of the master plan. But what you see below is the wonderful Student Learning Center, which came about as a result of the master plan we did, designed by the Norwegian firm called Snøhetta, which creates a little terraced amphitheater on Gould Street, which is now turning into a pedestrian street off Yonge, and is part of a whole transformation. And it is really part of a movement where all of our public institutions, museums, university faculties, are all turning themselves out to the city. So in this university, one of the great examples of this, of course, is the Faculty of Architecture, taking over the Connaught Labs building. The circle, the Spadina Circle, first shows up on a plan in the 19th century. This Spadina Avenue was, of course, originally a way of getting from the lake up to Spadina House. And there was a kind of circle drawn in the middle called Spadina Gardens, which eventually became the building that you see there, which serves so many purposes, did so much great science, and more recently has been taken over by the School of Architecture. I would encourage you to visit it. It's a wonderful facility. It invites the public in and through the building, and it's part of that extroverted way that public institutions have become out-facing as opposed to inward-facing.
Can you take a break, give people a break?
Sure, I'm almost done, but yeah, absolutely. Want to take a break now? Another 5 minutes? Okay, great. So something I'm currently involved in is Sidewalk Labs down at Quayside. And the reason I am so interested in this and why I have involved myself in it is I think that technology is one of those challenges. A lot of my career, as you can probably tell, was dealing with the over-embrace of the automobile after World War II and recovering from that. So I'm very interested in the way new technologies get absorbed, and in particular the digital world. So these are some images from what Quayside, should it be approved, will look like, and it's a way of using technology to advance human-centered values, not to divorce ourselves from the physical world and from each other. So I've devoted a whole chapter in the book to that. I have another chapter that deals with the transformation of the suburbs, the 905. And I worked with Hazel McCallion on a plan for Mississauga, downtown Mississauga 2021, where this regional shopping mall gets transformed into the city center that you see below, with tens of thousands of people living around, with a new city hall, with the Living Arts Center, with the YMCA, with Sheridan College coming in, and quite literally the parking lots, the thousands of parking lots, parking spaces that you see above, all becoming part of a city with streets and blocks and buildings and life and activity, and now a new light rail coming up here, Ontario, from Port Credit, serving this area. And that every 905 municipality is now undergoing a version of this. Public Space Incubator is something my wife and I have financed for 2 years with the Balsam Foundation, where we identify startup projects, ideas relating to public space, and each year for 2 years we've selected 5 of these to get grants, and they are amazing examples that are popping up all over the city. So from the transformation of Nicholson Lane in the St. Lawrence area, Plaza Pops up on Lawrence Avenue in Scarborough, taking over a part of a parking lot in the strip mall to create a public space. Red Embers, done with an indigenous group in Allen Gardens to celebrate that presence. Thorncliffe Community Cafe with a wonderful community activist named Sabina Ali. At Stack, the little container village at Front and Bathurst, an observation deck for kids overlooking the trains, which they love to do. And we've now just selected a new group for the second year, which you see here, from something called Snack Revolution, which is a kind of night market for food. Oculus taking over a wonderful structure, upper right, at the beginning of the Humber Valley, and turning what was originally designed as a public washroom into a public performance space, an indigenous garden, a pop-up playground in the Bentway, and what's called Corner Commons at Jane and Finch. So these are fantastic. So basically, what the book is about, even though I deal with all these individual stories, I then try and put all the stories together and talk about how together they are transforming the city and how they're tying together all the disparate pieces of where we live. This, I turned in the manuscript, the book was getting ready to publish, and then we had the provincial election, June 5th, 2018, and I was watching what the Ford government was doing, and I said, I cannot let the book be published without talking about this. The message just falls flat unless we acknowledge the threats that are arising. So this speaks to an event that we held at Ryerson called Toronto Interrupted. It was moderated by Royce and James from the Star. Josh Matlow took part in it, a number of other people. And so I've devoted a whole chapter to the threats that are arising from the Ford government. And I think actually this might be a good place to stop, because I have another little topic that I don't want to cut too short. So let's take a little break here and we'll come back. Okay, can we get started again, please? So when I stopped just before the break, I talked about the threat, multiple threats that are actually coming from some of the actions of the provincial government now. And I won't go into it all now, but I argue in the book, I will just say this, that despite all claims to the contrary, it actually has nothing to do with the money, nothing to do with the deficit. I think it really has everything to do with a different conception of what a city is. And their view of the city is private individuals and individual households solving all their problems as much as possible privately and through private resources versus the idea of a city as a collectivity where we solve things together. And I think that is a profound threat. And I was just talking to my grandkids on Saturday, and they were telling me about how this has affected their schooling. And the fact that my youngest granddaughter is now in a class with 40 kids, that they've cut the length of the school day for both of them, and that all the special classes that they had in the public education system are gone. It's really stripped down to the bare essentials. So it really brought home to me just one of the many things that's happening. So another thing I write about is a second serious challenge, you might say a threat, which is what's happening in the digital world. And so this is from an article that appeared recently in the New Yorker magazine by Nathan Heller, who talks about the automobile and how we abuse that technology. And I write extensively about that in the book. But this is something that keeps me up at night now. I know, I laugh too, but it is actually not so funny, because I think what it is doing is producing a generation of generations who are so involved in this technology, who are uncritically adopting it in ways which will have profound consequences for them and for us. And as you probably know, if you have grandchildren, there's a whole group of people who would rather text than talk. They find it awkward to have a live conversation with somebody. This is extraordinary. What they're missing out on is body language, is nuance, is facial expression. This is a serious issue. And this is where it gets most serious, which is what happens with the echo chambers on the internet that separate people so they don't connect. So on the left, what you see is the red and blue represent the two sides of the issue, Brexit and Remain, and how little communication there is across the divide. In fact, people are only talking to like-minded people to the point where they just simply can't communicate. On the right, it's even worse in the US. And as you probably know, if you have friends or family there, depending on how you identify as pro-Trump or anti-Trump, there is zero communication anymore. The people are only receiving information through their particular echo chamber. This, and I don't need to talk about the consequences of this. So I devote quite a bit to this in the book, and why public space, common ground, is so important, quite literally and figuratively. So I'm going to show you a pair of images which tell the whole story for me in a nutshell. I took this picture in Palo Alto in a Starbucks. Starbucks is designed for people to be alone. They get their coffee, and you can see all the little tables, and every single person in this Starbucks is on some form of device. Nobody is talking to anybody. This is my favorite cafe. It's on King Street, just around the corner from where I live. It's called Forno Cultura. It is owned and operated by a friend. His name is Andrea Mastrandea. He studied architecture, and he went into the family business. And there are two things about this cafe that are really interesting. One of them is he deliberately has no Wi-Fi. The second is, if you look at the tables in the back where people are sitting, the tables are 30 centimeters wide, a foot. And so you almost are invited to have a conversation with people who are sitting on the stools beside you or in front of you. And of course there's technology. The cashier is using a way of charging people that's based on technology. People pay with credit cards, all of that stuff. But people are actually involved in lively conversations all day long in this place. And you always end up meeting people you didn't know when you came in. And he and the other people in the cafe act as kind of hosts. And they kind of walk around and they chat with people. And through that, it's people go there because it's sociable. And I think this is a quality that we absolutely must have.
Could you repeat the name of the cafe?
Forno Cultura. Forno is oven, cultural oven, which is what it is. So the real question is, how do you write an optimistic book, which my book essentially is, in a moment of great turbulence, given what's happening on the government side and the challenges posed by everything from affordability to climate change to mobility, and then this digital threat. And my fundamental, I wrestle with this all the time, and I come down on the side of, I'll take you back to that image of my arriving at Union Station once a week in the morning. I think the human capital that we have absorbed in this city, and the fact that we are all somehow committed to make it work, to make this great experiment that we're involved in successful, makes me realize that this is a long game. I think we will survive this. I think what the government has done, it was often said about Rob Ford that he was the best community organizer the city ever had, because he basically encouraged people to get together to fight back. And I think you could say the same thing is happening with his brother. The civil society is stepping up in all kinds of ways in defense of all the things that are under siege or under threat right now. And I think we will come out of this okay. And that's basically the conclusion. So in the end, this is not just a book about what we've done and what we've done well and what the challenges are. Ultimately, it's advocacy. What I'm really calling for is for people to get involved in working with their city, our city, so that we can realize that promise that we've been given of a city for all. Thank you very much. So I had a few questions, which I'll try and get to. We have another 7 minutes, I think, before we have to get out of here. One of them is about developers taking over the waterfront. And this really goes back to, you have to go back to Harborfront in the 1980s. And when we started to get the proverbial wall of condos that people talked about, there was a developer, a very almost scandalous situation with a developer called Wang and Dansky. And at the moment when the economy had collapsed and we had the Harper government in Ottawa, and Harborfront was basically cut off from all its funding and was being forced to try and survive by its own devices. The leadership at Harborfront made some really unfortunate decisions about selling land to developers who put up a really nasty row of condos across the front of the lake. And this was being replicated in other places. If you looked at the mouth of the Humber, you were having something similar happen. And I think Torontonians got really upset about this. Or I know they did. And to the point where the Harborfront Corporation, as a development company, was disbanded. And what we know of as Harborfront Center occupies only 10 acres of the 80 acres of the original Harborfront. And David Crombie, who wrote the foreword in my book, who's a dear, dear friend, was called in to try and deal with this, which led to an organization that he founded, which really looked more broadly at the waterfront. He brought in the whole concept of ecosystem planning. He called attention to the watersheds extending all the way up to the Oak Ridges Moraine and to the value of our shoreline as a public resource. This was called the Waterfront Regeneration Trust. And the Waterfront Regeneration Trust, in many ways, led to the creation of Waterfront Toronto, which went after a failed Olympic bid, but has existed for over 20 years and has had provincial, federal, and municipal support from politicians of all stripes. And I think we've now turned a corner. And if you see the newest neighborhoods that are being created on the waterfront, the West Don Lands, which was where the Pan Am Athletes Village was, with Corktown Common as the great park. If you look at the East Bayfront, where you have Sugar Beach and Sherbourne Common, and you have the promenade all along the water, I think there's a real move now in everything that comes to ensure the publicness of the waterfront. And what's wonderful about David Crombie's intervention is that's the very relatively small piece along Toronto Harbor, a few kilometers. David Crombie basically inspired people all the way around the periphery of Lake Ontario on the Canadian side and the American side in all the towns and cities that border the lake to work together on a waterfront trail system so that piece by piece you're being able to circumnavigate the entire lake. It's extending up to Lake Erie, Lake Huron. This has really become a phenomenon as people reclaim the public space on the edge of the water. So that's another important story. And again, I'll finish up about that. Sidewalk and privacy concerns. Very hard to summarize this in a few words, but the issue is that with or without sidewalk labs and Quayside, the 12 acres, when we walk out on the street, when we walk out of this building, if we have a cell phone, we are being monitored. Our every move is being tracked. The whole idea of these large tech companies developing capabilities and resources that are so far exceeding government's ability to monitor and control is really, really serious. And the interesting thing about Sidewalk, and the reason that I have been involved in it since 2015, before they decided to come to Toronto, is it is an opportunity to actually engage with the advent of technology, which, like it or not, is a reality. And as I was pointing out with the younger generations, the dependency on that technology is something that we can't even understand. We're not, as they say, digital natives. They have withdrawal symptoms. If they have to sit here as long as you've sat here, how many of you have been checking your phone constantly during this? When I give lectures to people in their 20s, they're all sitting there with their phones. They're half listening to me and they're half, who knows where, somewhere else. And so the sidewalk thing is an opportunity to actually negotiate the rules of engagement in a very different way, openly, with the idea of a public data trust. It's basically pushing government to take on the roles that it must play. It's about who controls the data, the fact that it will all be controlled publicly through a data trust, the anonymity of data, the fact that the data can't be commercialized. At least there's a chance to talk about the appropriate use of the technology. and put the emphasis, surprisingly, on doing many things with no tech or low tech, as opposed to tech solutions. But that's a whole story in itself. Final question is the idea of a Toronto City Charter. And as you may know, back when the B&A Act was created in 1867, cities were made what is called the creatures of the provinces. Prior to that, or at that time, 80% of the Canadian population was rural, lived on farms, and only 20% lived in a number of relatively small cities. Cities were simply not seen as important. And so they picked up the conventional wisdom of the time, and they turned over all the authority to the provinces. And the kind of issues they were worried about at the time was pigs running around wild in the streets. Nobody ever imagined an urban society where 80% of us now live in a handful of big city regions in this country, where the city of Toronto has a population that's bigger than quite a few of the provinces, where the issues we're dealing with are extremely complex, and where the vulnerability of our city and all cities in Canada to the vicissitudes of changes at the provincial level and intervention by the province, including just in the middle of an election, slashing the size of the city council in half, to take an example. So my whole chapter is devoted to all these egregious interventions in aid of essentially disempowering the city, making the city infantile and unable to carry out decisions. So there's a movement that started, which is based on a one charter, one province amendment to the Constitution. So you don't have to engage all the provinces, which would give the City of Toronto charter status, what's called home rule in other countries. And I am supporting John Sewell and Josh Matlow and a number of others who are trying to make this happen. I think it's something that must happen. Doug Ford has revealed just quite how vulnerable we are. By noblesse oblige, we've never seen this before, this level of disrespect for Toronto and for cities, but it needs to be addressed. And I see we've come to the end. I'm very sorry we won't have time for more questions. Thank you.
Ken, it's been another education, and we're so glad to have you here. I know there's a bottomless fund of stories there that you could tell us, and I wish we had the time to have you do that. I know we'll have you back. So it's been a wonderful hour and a half, and thank you very much. And a quick announcement for next week. There's been a reversal of the two following weeks. David Hilchansky will present next week, and the person who's going to present next week, Carolyn King, will be the following week. And there are still book signing available, probably out in the foyer.